War leaves deep marks on any culture, win or lose. It can cause an entire culture to die or to disperse across the world in a diaspora. It can make a generation carry guilt or lust for revenge. It certainly shouldn't be ignored if you have war in your world to think about what the effect is on your cultures. So today, let's talk about the scars that wars leave on the losers of a war and what effect that could have in your fantasy world. Welcome to another episode of Just in Time Worlds with your host, Marie Mullaney. If you like this kind of content and you want to support me in making more of it, there is a link to my Ko-fi page down below where you can leave a once-off donation or become a monthly member. Or you can buy my books available on Amazon.com, The Sangwheel Chronicles. Either way, thank you very much to all my supporters who make it a lot easier to make these videos. Okay, let's crack on. First, I do have to issue a disclaimer. Today's topic is controversial. It is the aftermath of war, and that can get to be a touchy subject. What I say today is literally just my opinion on observations of history and what I think caused changes in general cultures around the world based on the effects of war. So you can disagree with me and let me know down in the comments if you think I'm wrong, but it is just an opinion. Okay, let's start with the Punic Wars. So the Punic Wars were fought between Carthage and Rome, and it was fought for dominion of the Mediterranean Sea. Now, I'm not going to cover exhaustively every event in the Punic Wars. There are a lot of videos on them. Oversimplified has got a video on them. OSP has got a video on them. So there's plenty of Punic War events if you want to go into details. What I'm going to talk about is the effects that the war had on the culture of Carthage. So when the first Punic War kicked off, it kicked off due to a dispute on the island of Sicily. And at this time, Carthage was a naval powerhouse. They had a massive merchant navy. They did not have nobility in Carthage. They had a republic, as did Rome at the time, and they were merchant driven. So rich families controlled Carthage, unlike Rome, which had its patricians. So Rome didn't have a king, but they did have the patricians. So Carthage was this naval powerhouse, but Rome barely had a navy to speak of. And yet Rome adapted really well. So they reverse engineered Carthage's ships and they invaded Carthage and finally won the First Punic War. At the end of the war, Rome levied a large debt on Carthage. So they demanded tribute from Carthage, much more than Carthage could afford to pay. And they took the provinces of Corsica from Carthage. This led to a lot of bitterness in the Carthaginian merchantmen. And in fact, a dude called Hamilcar eventually went to Spain and conquered and colonized that territory in order to mine it for silver in order to repay Rome. But Hamilcar was the father of Hannibal, and he raised his son to take vengeance on the Romans. So you can see how that injured enemy that was Carthage was not completely destroyed. They were just made into a vengeful nation that sought to reignite the war. So this happens when you have a powerful culture, a culture that had glory and that is defeated and left wounded but not killed. That's when you give rise to this kind of vengeance-driven culture. And this did indeed result in the Second Punic War, when Hannibal famously marched over the Alps with his elephants and basically laid sack to the Italian countryside. For 16 years, He terrorized the Italian countryside, defeating multiple Roman armies. And some of those battles are still studied by strategists today because Hannibal really was an exceptional general. It is well worth looking into those battles if you're doing military history to see how Hannibal strategized around winning those battles. But either way, Rome was an exceptionally adaptable culture, and eventually General Scipio the Great, Scipio the Legend, went to Spain, and he freed Spain from Hannibal's brother Hasdrubal, and eventually Hasdrubal died, and then the Scipio took the fight to Carthage itself, and Hannibal had to race home to try and defend Carthage. And Scipio beat Hannibal right there in Africa. This was the end of the Second Punic War, and this time Rome didn't leave a wounded enemy behind. They stomped on Carthage. Carthage was not allowed to go to war without Rome's permission. They lost their entire empire. They lost all of their overseas territories. They became pretty much a vassal state of Rome, and a vassal state Rome didn't want and wouldn't protect. So what this created in the Carthaginians was bitterness. It was a broken civilization in the ruins of what had once been great. It can still be a dangerous culture, but generally it's a culture that lives on past glory, a culture that takes centuries to recover because they have been mud puddle stomped into being such a lesser culture. To some extent, this happened to the Scots after Bonnie Prince Charlie tried for the English throne and lost. The English went into Scotland and they forbade the wearing of the tartan and the speaking of Gaelic, and that wrecked the Scottish culture. So you can see that when you do that kind of activity where you take something that was a strong nation, that was a strong culture, and you then mud stomp them down, you create a deep and lasting bitterness. But there were 3 Punic Wars. So the Nubians started raiding Carthage, and Rome wouldn't even let them defend themselves. Rome denied them permission to go to war with the Nubians. In fact, a dude called Cato the Censor would end every speech with Delenda est Carthago. Carthage must be destroyed. That is how Rome felt about Carthage. And in the end, Cato and the other hardliners came out on top, and when Carthage did defend themselves against the raids of their rival kingdoms, Rome came one more time to Africa, and this time they burnt Carthage to the ground. The only survivors from that massacre were the slaves that Rome took in tribute. Everybody else died. Total destruction of the culture and of the people of Carthage. This resulted in Carthage living on only as a memory, only as a tragic story, only as a warning to other cultures, to other enemies of Rome. This is what happens to you when you oppose Rome. You get stomped into a mud puddle, your city is burnt, your people enslaved. So that obviously completely destroyed Carthage as a culture, and they live forward only in these memories. Okay, that was a rather depressing story, I'm sorry. But, if you enjoyed talking about the Punic War in terms of the effect that it had on Carthage, hit the thumbs up button. And let's talk about the Second World War. So I want to talk about Finland, specifically in the Second World War, and the effects that the post-Second World War had on Finland. So back in 1939, the Soviet army, totaling about 1 million men, attacked Finland. Now, at the time, we were a very young nation. I mean, we still are to a certain extent. We only recently celebrated 100 years. But we were very young back then. We were barely 20 years old as a nation. We defended ourselves as best we could, but 1 million men, it pretty much exceeded our population. And during the winter, we managed to keep the Soviets out, and that was, of course, the time when Simo Hayao was active. He's also known as the White Death, and he had around 500 kills on the battlefield. He was a sniper. So we did very well, and we were very proud of ourselves for keeping the Red Army out. But in February of 1940, Stalin used artillery bombardments and breached the Mannerheim Line, the defensive line on our eastern border. And the Brits and the French wouldn't help us because they were courting Stalin as an ally, so they could hardly help Finland defend against the Soviet army. So eventually we had to sign the Treaty of Moscow, and we had to cede Western Karelia and allow a Soviet naval base to be built at Hanko, which is a town just down the road from where I live. Now, this, of course, created a great deal of bitterness in Finland, as well as creating somewhat of a seeking of revenge feeling, especially since we were such a young nation, and we had actually managed to defend ourselves during the winter. To then lose in the spring, it just left a really bitter taste in the mouth of the Finns. We didn't have a formal alliance with Germany, but Mannerheim was real friendly with Hitler, to the extent where Hitler gate-crashed Mannerheim's birthday party. And if you're interested in hearing what Hitler's voice sounded like when he wasn't speaking as an orator, that is the only surviving tape of Hitler's voice was at Mannerheim's birthday party, when the Finns recorded Hitler without the knowledge of the SS. So you can find that tape on YouTube, and I will link down below if you're interested in listening to that conversation. It is all in German, but there are subtitles. Anyway, so Finland was friendly with Germany, and they allowed German troops to transit through Finland in 1941 when Hitler attacked the Soviet Union. And Finland, in the end, joined the fight against the Soviets at Germany's side, undertaking the War of Continuation. Now, obviously, as one of the Axis powers, albeit a tiny one that wasn't formally allied with the rest, we lost the Second World War. And we signed the Armistice of September 1944, and eventually the peace between us and the Soviet Union was formalized. And we were levied with war debt, as were all of the Axis nations. And it had a strange and profound effect on the Finnish culture. So first, you should understand that we did pay back our war debt. We are the only nation to have done so of all of those who had war debt coming out of the Second World War. And this was a subject of immense pride to the generations that were involved in that debt repayment, because it wasn't just the case of the government repaying debt. People pawned their wedding rings in order to pay additional money into the government's coffers in order to repay Finland's war debt. We all wanted to get out of it. So that became actually a source of pride to those people, that we had paid back our debt that had been levied due to the war. There was also the pride of defense juxtaposed with the fact that we allied with Hitler. We allied with a regime of evil. So we're proud that we defended ourselves against the Soviet army that rampaged on our border, but there is some shame in the measures that we went to. So it's a very complicated relationship, and I think that you can have such a relationship arise in your culture if you have a young nation that didn't expect to win and yet retained their independence in the face of overwhelming odds. So we lost, but we retained our independence. So unlike Carthage that had a great empire, we did not have the expectation of having a great empire. We'd never been a massive empire. We just wanted to have our independence. And in the end, we retained that despite losing. So really, when you're thinking about the effect that losing a war has on a culture in your world, it is about expectations. What does the culture expect when they're defending themselves? Do they expect to win? Because if they do and they lose, it is probable that they will end up bitter and lusting for revenge. If they are just hoping to survive and they manage to come out of the fight with some pride intact, they will probably look back on that war almost as a victory, despite the fact that they lost, just because they retained their independence. In fact, Finland, during the Cold War, remained neutral because, well, yes, we agreed with Stalin that we would remain neutral, but we also took a pride in providing a place that was a meeting place between the Soviet Union and the Western world. And Russia turned out to be a great trading partner. We sold a lot of goods into Russia, and we became wealthy off that trade. So that I wouldn't say that they became a friend exactly, but they were not our enemy nation after that. Little bit dicey at the moment. So you can see that the difference between, say, us and Carthage is the difference in expectation of the nation. So think about that when you are creating your culture that's lost the war. If you want that culture to have a certain pride despite having lost, make them a young nation. Make them expect to have lost, and then by hook or by crook, somehow keep their independence. If you want that culture to have a bitterness and a drive for revenge, give them an empire which they lose as a result of losing the war, even if they manage to keep the borders of their core nation together. What do you think the impact is of losing a war on a culture? Let me know in the comments below. And if you like this video, check out my video on creating a magical army in a fantasy world. And if you want to connect around this or any other topic, remember that I do have a Discord server linked down below, and I will see you soon for another episode of Just in Time World.